October 13th, 1988. Rain fell in cold, relentless sheets, turning the Bronx into a watercolor of bleeding streetlights and slick, black asphalt. A 1987 Lincoln Town Car, its dark paint swallowing the dim light, moved north on the major Deegan Expressway. Inside, the only sounds were the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the soft hiss of the tires on the wet road. Paulie the Bull Frotto sat in the passenger seat staring out at the blurred cityscape. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, its weight not entirely from the fabric. Tucked inside his belt, pressing against his lower back, was a 22-ounce ball-peen hammer, its steel head cold and dense. Beside him, driving with an unnerving calm, was Frankie Gallo, a man known only as Frankie G. In the back seat, two other soldiers, broad-shouldered and silent, sat like statues, their eyes fixed on the road ahead. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The orders, delivered by Sam Giancana's own voice in the smoky confines of the Ravenite, had been perfectly clear. This was not a hit. It was a lesson. A piece of street theater where the main actor would end the performance in a hospital and the audience would leave with a new, profound understanding of the old ways. They exited the expressway and navigated the narrow, unfamiliar streets of Woodlawn, a neighborhood so thoroughly Irish it felt like a different country. Green shamrocks were painted on storefronts, and the pubs, one on nearly every corner, glowed with a warm, inviting light. They were deep in enemy territory. Frankie G parked the Lincoln across the street from their destination, a pub called the Emerald Rose. Its green neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow on the wet pavement. Through the large front window, they could see the silhouettes of men laughing, drinking, their voices a low, indecipherable rumble. Paulie watched for 3 minutes, his gaze methodical. He noted the number of men at the bar, the layout of the tables, the position of the back door. He was identifying his target, Mickey Dolan, holding court in a large booth at the rear. Dolan was a big man with a florid face and a booming laugh that could be heard even through the thick glass. He looked invincible, surrounded by his loyalists, the kings of this small, wet corner of the Bronx. "Let's go," Paulie said, his voice flat. The two men in the back got out first, flanking the car's rear. Paulie and Frankie G stepped out into the rain, not bothering to hurry. They crossed the street with a purpose that made a passing couple instinctively step aside. As they pushed open the heavy wooden door of the Emerald Rose, a wave of warmth, loud talk, and the smell of stale beer and whiskey washed over them. The chatter in the bar did not stop immediately, but it faltered. A dozen conversations dwindled as heads turned to look at the four outsiders. They were not Irish. They were not locals. They wore expensive coats and expressions as hard and gray as the city pavement. Paulie's eyes locked on Mickey Dolan. He walked straight toward the back booth, his men fanning out behind him, creating a perimeter. Frankie G stayed a few feet back, his hand inside his coat, a silent promise of something far worse than a fistfight. The men at Dolan's table started to rise, their faces shifting from confusion to anger. Dolan himself remained seated, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, a smirk on his face. "You're a long way from home, fellas," Dolan said, his voice laced with arrogant amusement. "Lost?" Paulie stopped at the edge of the table. He was shorter than Dolan, but his presence seemed to suck the air out of the space around him. "Mr. Dolan," Paulie said, his tone conversational, almost polite. "We have a message for you from Mulberry Street, from Mr. Giancana. He heard you were telling people that times are changing." He paused, letting the name hang in the now silent room. "He wanted us to remind you that some things never change." Before Dolan could process the words, before his smirk could fade, Paulie moved. With a speed that was terrifying in a man his size, he reached into his coat and pulled out the ball-peen hammer. He did not swing it wildly. The motion was short, economical, and brutally precise. The rounded head of the hammer connected with Mickey Dolan's left kneecap with a sickening, wet crunch that echoed in the stunned silence. Dolan screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony that was cut short as he pitched forward. Paulie stepped around the table and, with the same methodical calm, brought the hammer down on Dolan's right kneecap. Another crack, another strangled cry. Mickey Dolan collapsed to the floor, writhing, his legs bent at unnatural angles. The men in the booth were frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, calculated brutality of the attack. Frankie G took a step forward, his hand now resting on the grip of a tire iron he had pulled from his sleeve, his eyes daring any of them to move. Paulie looked down at the whimpering man on the floor. "He wants you to remember this conversation," Paulie said to Dolan, his voice barely a whisper. "He wants you to have a lot of time to think about it. Every time you try to stand. Every time you feel the rain." He then calmly tucked the hammer back into his belt, straightened his overcoat, and turned. He surveyed the terrified faces of the patrons, his cold gaze sweeping across the room. "Respect," he said, the single word cutting through the fear. Then he and his men walked out, leaving the door to swing shut behind them, back into the anonymity of the rain-swept New York night. October 14th, 1988. The fluorescent lights of the FBI's New York field office at 26 Federal Plaza hummed with a monotonous institutional buzz. The air inside tasted of stale coffee and recycled paper. Here, the city's chaos was distilled into neat manila folders, organized crime charts, and the quiet, persistent clicking of typewriters. In a cramped office overlooking the gray expanse of Lower Manhattan, Special Agent David Driscoll stared at a grainy black and white surveillance photograph pinned to a corkboard. It showed Sam Giancana stepping out of a black sedan, his face obscured by shadow and the angle of his hat. It was the best picture they had from the last 5 years. Driscoll was a man in his late 40s with the weary eyes of someone who had spent too many nights listening to static-filled wiretaps that yielded nothing. His suit was rumpled, his tie was loose, and a half-empty mug of cold coffee sat on his desk next to a file stamped Giancana S that was at least 6 inches thick. It was Driscoll who, in a moment of profound frustration years ago, had first called Sam Giancana Moby Dick. It was meant to be a private joke among the agents of the Organized Crime Task Force, a nod to their captain's obsessive and thus far fruitless hunt. But the name had leaked, taken root, and become legend. Now, it was a constant reminder of his own failure. A younger agent, Special Agent Carter, stepped into the office holding a teletype flimsy. "Morning, Dave. Got a report from the 47th Precinct up in the Bronx. You're going to want to see this." He handed the paper to Driscoll. Driscoll read it, his expression unchanging, but a new intensity sharpened his gaze. The report detailed an aggravated assault at a pub called the Emerald Rose. The victim, Michael Mickey Dolan. The injuries, bilateral comminuted patella fractures. Both kneecaps shattered. The suspected weapons, hammers. The witnesses, a bar full of people who suddenly could not remember a thing. "Hammers," Driscoll said, the word coming out as a flat statement of fact. "Not guns, not knives. Hammers." He stood up and walked over to the large organizational chart on his wall, a complex web of names and faces connected by lines of association. His finger traced a line from Sam Giancana down to Vincent Giancana, then branched off to a capo, and finally to a low-level soldier. He tapped a photo of a thick-necked man with dead eyes. Paoli Frato, the Bull. He spent 3 years in Attica for beating a man nearly to death with a table leg. This is his signature. Carter shifted his weight. The locals think it's an internal dispute with the Vesties. Dolan was getting too greedy. Driscoll shook his head, a flicker of a grim smile on his face. "This is not a dispute. This is a sermon. Last month, the Port Authority awarded the concrete contract for the new terminal expansion at JFK. It went to a company secretly controlled by the Vesties, a contract that has belonged to Giancana's Front, Triborough Cement, for the last 20 years. This wasn't about greed. This was about heresy." He turned back to his desk and picked up the thick file. "Sam doesn't kill rivals anymore. Killing a man makes him a martyr. It inspires revenge. Crippling a man, leaving him to limp through the rest of his life as a broken reminder. That inspires fear. And fear is how he maintains control." The problem, as always, was the ghost himself. Driscoll had spent a decade of his life mapping the Giancana crime family. He knew their rackets, from the Garment District shakedowns to the Union control at the Fulton Fish Market. He had wiretaps, informants, surveillance teams. But it was like trying to photograph the wind. Giancana existed only in the consequences he created. He never spoke on the phone. He never met in a place that had not been swept for bugs a dozen times. His orders were delivered in person, often in moving cars or during a walk through Central Park, phrased as suggestions or hypothetical questions. He was a king who ruled from an invisible throne, insulated by layers of deniability. "So, we know it was him," Carter said, stating the obvious frustrating truth. "But we cannot prove it. Fratto will have an alibi. The witnesses will have amnesia. The hammers are probably at the bottom of the East River. It is the same old story." Driscoll ran a hand through his hair. He was tired of the story. He walked to the window and looked down at the city below. From this height, it looked orderly, peaceful. But he knew the truth. He knew about the invisible empires that coiled beneath the surface, ancient things with their own laws and their own brutal forms of justice. "No," Driscoll said, turning from the window. "Not this time. This was different. This was public. He sent a message to the entire underworld. That means he is feeling pressured. That means he felt the need to be loud." He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. "And when they get loud, they make mistakes." "Where are you going?" Carter asked. "To the hospital," Driscoll replied, pulling on his coat. "Mickey Dolan thought he was the future. This morning he is a broken man in a hospital bed who will never walk right again. Maybe he is finally ready to listen to a different point of view. Maybe he is angry enough to help us harpoon a whale." November 2nd, 1988. The air carried the first real bite of winter, a sharp, metallic chill that swept in off the Atlantic and across the vast, windswept plains of John F. Kennedy International Airport. Here, amidst the deafening roar of jet engines and the skeletal frames of new construction, the Giancana family's power was not subtle or hidden. It was written in thousands of tons of steel and concrete. Tri-Borough Cement, a company whose official owner was a retired dock worker living in Florida, held a virtual monopoly on the concrete supply for every major public works project in the 5 boroughs. It was the bedrock of Sam Giancana's financial empire, a river of legitimate money so vast it could wash clean the profits from 100 illegal enterprises. Leo, the accountant. Grossi stood beside his modest Ford Taurus, a hard hat perched awkwardly on his thin, graying hair. He hated construction sites. They were loud, dirty, and chaotic, an offense to his orderly, numerical world. But Sam had sent him, and Leo's loyalty was as absolute as the numbers in his ledgers. He was here to meet with the site foreman for the new international terminal project, a man named Jimmy O'Malley. After the incident with Mickey Dolan, the Port Authority had quietly reversed its decision. The contract was back in Tri-Borough's hands. The Vesties had retreated, nursing their wounds and their wounded pride. Today was about re-establishing the old order. O'Malley approached, a big man whose face was a permanent shade of red from the wind and sun. He wiped his dusty hands on his jeans before shaking Leo's. "Mr. Grossi, good to see you. The first trucks are rolling in now. We are back on schedule." Leo nodded, his eyes scanning the massive foundation being laid. Dozens of concrete mixers, their drums churning slowly, were lined up, each bearing the discreet Tri-Borough logo. "That is good to hear, Jimmy," Leo said, his voice precise and soft, forcing O'Malley to lean in to hear him over the din. "Mr. Giancana appreciates efficiency. He also appreciates clarity. There was some confusion about the arrangements for this project." O'Malley's face tightened. He knew exactly what this was about. "Look, the Port Authority makes the calls. It was out of my hands." Leo gave a slight dismissive wave. "The past is the past. We are concerned with the future. Going forward, there will be a new line item in your budget, a logistical facilitation fee. It will be 2% of the gross cost of all materials delivered to this site. Payable in cash every Friday." O'Malley's jaw dropped. 2%? On a project this size? That is hundreds of thousands of dollars. I cannot hide that. Leo's expression did not change, but a coldness entered his eyes. "You are a foreman, Jimmy. You are a man who understands how things work. Materials get lost. Overtime gets padded. Invoices get duplicated. You will find a way. Consider it the price of a smooth and uninterrupted workflow." He paused, letting the implication settle. "We would hate for there to be any union disputes, safety inspections, or equipment malfunctions. Things of that nature can be so unpredictable. Meanwhile, 5 miles away, in a sterile room at Jacoby Medical Center, Special Agent David Driscoll was having a very different kind of conversation. The smell of antiseptic could not quite mask the underlying scent of sickness and despair. Mickey Dolan lay in a hospital bed, his legs encased in plaster from his ankles to his thighs, held in a rigid, elevated position. The arrogant, booming crime boss from the Emerald Rose was gone. In his place was a pale, diminished man whose eyes were clouded with pain and a simmering, helpless rage. Driscoll sat in a plastic chair by the bed. He had been there for 45 minutes, speaking in a low, calm voice, not asking questions, simply laying out facts. "You know who sent them, Mickey," Driscoll said, "and you know why. It was not about a union. It was about JFK. It was about Triborough Cement. He made an example of you. He left you alive so every other contractor, every union boss, every wise guy in this city would see you and know what happens when you take a piece of what belongs to Sam Giancana." Dolan stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. "I have got nothing to say to you, Fed." "I am not asking you to testify," Driscoll countered smoothly. "You would be dead before the subpoena was printed. I understand that. But you are a proud man. He took your legs, Mickey. He took your pride. He did it in front of your people to humiliate you. And now, he is making millions off the very contract you bled for. Does that sit right with you?" The silence stretched. Driscoll could see the war happening behind Dolan's eyes. A lifetime of street code warring with a raw, primal need for revenge. "What do you want?" Dolan finally rasped, his eyes shifting from the ceiling to meet Driscoll's. "I do not want a witness," Driscoll said, leaning forward slightly. "I want a map. Giancana is a ghost. He never touches the money. He never gives the order on tape. But the money has to move. The concrete is the key. Triborough is his bank. I need to know how it works. Who are the bagmen? Where are the drop points? How does a 2% kickback on a $100 million project disappear between the construction site and Sam's pocket? You were on the inside of that world long enough to hear things. Names, places. Give me a thread, Mickey. Just one thread to pull on, and I will unravel his entire world for you." Dolan looked at his own useless legs, at the white plaster tombs that held the shattered remnants of his old life. The code of silence was for men who still had a world to protect. Mickey Dolan's world had been smashed with a hammer in a noisy bar in the Bronx. "There is a guy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A bagman. They call him the Accountant." December 21st, 1988. Christmas lights twinkled uselessly against the grimy facades of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A cold, steady drizzle fell, making the streets slick and the holiday decorations look cheap and forlorn. In this neighborhood of tightly packed brick houses and meticulously kept gardens, Leo Grossi lived a life of deliberate, almost aggressive, normalcy. He lived in the same 2-story house he had grown up in. He drove a 3-year-old American car. He was known to his neighbors as a quiet, retired accountant who kept to himself. This anonymity was his greatest asset. While men like Paulie Fratto enforced Sam Giancana's will with hammers, Leo Grossi did it with a fountain pen and a ledger book, his actions far more devastating and infinitely harder to trace. Inside his home, in a small windowless office in the basement, Leo was performing the weekly ritual. The room was his sanctuary, Spartan and impeccably organized. A steel desk, a single chair, and a row of gray, fireproof filing cabinets. There was no art on the walls, only a calendar. Laid out on the desk were the spoils of the Giancana Empire. Envelopes and small bags filled with cash, collected that day by a trusted network of runners from a dozen different locations. The kickbacks from the JFK construction site, the skim from the Fulton Fish Market, the protection money from the Garment District, the profits from illegal gambling dens in Queens. It was a river of cash. And Leo was the dam keeper, meticulously counting, bundling, and recording every single dollar in a coded ledger. His system was a masterpiece of old-world simplicity and paranoia. He used a double-entry system of his own invention. One book, the official one, showed modest, believable profits for the family's legitimate businesses. The other, A small, leather-bound journal detailed the real cash flow. The entries were made in a code based on his mother's favorite Genoese recipes. A cash drop from a union boss might be recorded as 3 pounds of basil, a kickback from a contractor as 1 gallon of olive oil. It was archaic, analog, and he believed utterly unbreakable. To any outsider, it would look like the ramblings of a culinary enthusiast. To Sam Giancana, it was a perfect, real-time balance sheet of his criminal enterprise. Leo worked with a quiet intensity, his fingers stained slightly with ink, moving with practiced speed. He never used a counting machine. They were noisy and he felt disrespectful to the money. He counted by hand, his lips moving silently. Once counted, the cash was bundled and placed into a large, heavily reinforced safe hidden behind a false wall. This was the family's operating capital, the undeclared, untaxed lifeblood of their power. Tonight, the JFK payment was particularly large, nearly $100,000 in used, non-sequential bills. As he bundled the last stack, a sense of deep satisfaction settled over him. He was not a violent man. He had never thrown a punch in his life. But in this room, he wielded more power than any street soldier. He was the guardian of the family's secrets, the one man Sam trusted with the totality of his wealth. Unseen, unheard, 2 blocks away in an unmarked Con Edison utility van, Special Agent David Driscoll and his team were watching a ghost. An informant's tip, bought with the promise of a reduced sentence, had led them here, to this quiet street in Bensonhurst. For 3 weeks, they had been conducting round-the-clock surveillance on Leo Grossi. They had watched him leave for his morning coffee, pick up his dry cleaning, and go for quiet walks. It was excruciatingly dull. But Driscoll was patient. He knew men like Grossi built their lives on routine. The trick was to spot the one deviation, the single action that did not fit the pattern of a quiet retiree. And they had found it. Every Friday, like clockwork, a series of different men in different cars would arrive at a nearby park. They would leave their cars and walk a meandering, counter-surveillance route through the neighborhood, each carrying a briefcase or a gym bag. They would enter Leo's house, stay for no more than 10 minutes, and leave empty-handed. It was the pattern Driscoll had been searching for. Inside the van, a technician with headphones pressed to his ears leaned forward, his eyes closed in concentration. "I have got something," he whispered. "He is in the basement. I'm getting faint audio. Sounds like paper. The rustle of paper." Driscoll leaned closer to the monitor, which displayed a thermal image of the house. A faint heat signature emanated from the basement, a single, stationary figure. They had a court order, a black bag warrant to place a bug, but getting inside Leo's fortress had been deemed too risky. Instead, they were using a state-of-the-art laser microphone aimed at the basement window, which was barely a slit at ground level. The laser read the vibrations on the glass, translating them into sound. The quality was terrible, a symphony of hisses and crackles. But beneath it, if you listened hard enough, you could hear the soft, rhythmic flick of paper money being counted. "That is it," Driscoll said, his voice a low thrum of excitement. "That is the clearinghouse. That is where all the money goes." Agent Carter, sitting beside him, looked skeptical. "It is not enough, Dave. We have him counting paper in his own basement. A good lawyer will call him a hobbyist, a currency collector. We need to see inside that room. We need the books." Driscoll stared at the thermal image of the quiet house, the faint heat signature of the man inside. He knew Carter was right. They had found the bank, but they needed the key to the vault. "Then we will get the books," Driscoll said, his mind already working, formulating a plan. "Moby Dick is insulated, but his accountant is not. It is time to rattle Leo Grossi's cage, and when he runs to his boss for help, we will be there to listen." January 9th, 1989. The new year had brought no relief, only a colder, harder reality. A weak winter sun did little to warm the quiet streets of Bensonhurst. For 3 weeks, Leo Grossi's world had shrunk. It was now the size of his house, his car, and the 2 black Ford sedans that were perpetually parked on his block. They were always there, manned by 2 agents each, their faces impassive, their presence a suffocating weight on the entire neighborhood. They followed him when he went to the bakery. They waited outside the butcher shop. They were a constant, silent declaration of war. This morning, the war had escalated. The mail carrier, a man Leo had exchanged pleasantries with for 20 years, had handed him a certified letter from the Internal Revenue Service. Leo signed for it with a steady hand, but as he closed the door, he could feel a cold dread seeping into his bones. In the privacy of his kitchen, he slit the envelope open with a butter knife. The letter was dense with bureaucratic language, but the message was brutally simple. A full, comprehensive audit of his personal and professional finances, spanning the last 10 years. They were requesting every receipt, every bank statement, every tax return. Leo sat at his kitchen table for a full hour, the letter lying before him like a death sentence. It was a brilliant move, a perfect attack. They were not accusing him of racketeering or money laundering. They were burying him in the mundane, using his own world of numbers and regulations as a weapon against him. He had spent a lifetime creating a financial identity that was impeccable, a fortress of paper. Now, the government was demanding the keys to that fortress, and they were prepared to dismantle it brick by brick to see what was inside. He knew his official records were clean, but an investigation this deep was unpredictable. It would bring federal agents into his home, into his life, giving them a legitimate reason to be there. He had to get a message to Sam. But how? His home phone was certainly bugged. He was being followed. Any meeting would be observed. For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Leo Grossi felt the cold, sharp sting of panic. He forced it down. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. He would stick to his routine. He would give them nothing. He put on his overcoat and hat and walked out his front door, his face a mask of calm indifference. He nodded to the 2 agents in the car nearest his driveway. They did not nod back. He walked the 4 blocks to his favorite cafe, Cafe Palermo, the cold air stinging his cheeks. The bell over the door jingled as he entered, the familiar aroma of roasted coffee and anisette cookies enveloping him. He ordered as usual, an espresso macchiato, and sat at his regular small table in the corner. He needed to think. A moment later, the bell jingled again. Special Agent David Driscoll slid into the chair opposite him, uninvited. He placed his own coffee cup on the table. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "Mr. Grossi," Driscoll said, his voice low and even. "David Driscoll, FBI. I believe you've seen my colleagues around." Leo stared into his espresso cup. "I am a retired accountant. I have no business with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." "That is where you are wrong," Driscoll said, taking a sip of his coffee. "You see, we are interested in stories, and tax returns are a form of storytelling. Yours tells a fascinating one, a man of modest, declared income, no debts, a simple life. It is a good story, very believable. But we think there are some missing chapters." Leo's hand holding his small cup had a slight tremor. He placed it carefully back in its saucer. "I do not know what you are talking about." Driscoll leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Let me tell you another story, Leo. It is about a very smart, very loyal man. A man who handles the finances for a powerful organization. He takes all the risks. He touches the money. He keeps the secrets. He believes his boss will protect him because that is the old way. But the world is changing. The boss is insulated. He is a ghost. And when the pressure comes, when the government starts turning over rocks, the boss cannot afford to be connected to the man who handles the money, the loyal man, the numbers man. He becomes a liability. He is the one who goes to prison for 20 years. The boss sends his wife a casserole at Christmas and finds a new accountant. The end." Driscoll sat back. "We got a notice from the IRS this morning. Seems they are very interested in your story. They can be very thorough. It is a messy business. I am offering you a cleaner ending, Leo. A better one." For the first time, Leo looked up and met Driscoll's gaze. His eyes were dark with a mixture of fear and defiance. You are wasting your time, Agent. Am I? Driscoll said softly. He placed a business card on the table. When you realize I am not, call me, before it is too late. Driscoll stood up and walked out, leaving Leo alone at the table, his coffee cold, his world crumbling. Leo sat there for another 10 minutes, the agent's words echoing in his mind. He is the one who goes to prison. He knew Driscoll was right. Sam was untouchable, but he was not. He was the firewall. He looked at the business card, then pushed it away. He would not betray 50 years of loyalty. But he had to warn Sam. He had to tell him how close they were. He paid for his coffee, walked out of the cafe, and began a long, circuitous walk through the neighborhood, his mind racing, trying to find a way to reach a ghost while being haunted by his hunters. He turned a corner, then another, finally spotting what he was looking for on a busy intersection, a public payphone. He looked over his shoulder. The black sedan was half a block behind, caught in traffic. It was now or never. He slipped a quarter into the slot, his heart pounding against his ribs, and dialed a number he had never been meant to call directly, the back line of the Ravenite Social Club. January 10th, 1989. The air inside the Ravenite Social Club was thick with a tension that no amount of cigar smoke could obscure. Sam Giancana sat alone at the head of the long table, a single bare bulb overhead casting his face in a chiaroscuro of harsh light and deep shadow. He looked older than he had just a few months ago. The pressure, which for decades he had expertly deflected onto others, was now pressing in on him, on the inner circle. The call from Leo Grossi had been a shattering breach of protocol, a desperate act that spoke volumes about the state of his carefully constructed world. Leo, his calm, methodical, unbreakable accountant, was afraid. And if Leo was afraid, they were in real trouble. The door opened, and Vinny, the fist, Giancana, entered, his face a thundercloud of frustration. He had just come from a 3-hour drive around the outer boroughs, a futile attempt to shake the federal surveillance that had become as constant as the city traffic. "They are everywhere, Sammy," Vinny growled, slumping into a chair. "They are on Leo's house. They are on my house. They follow the capos. It is a full-court press. We cannot breathe." Sam did not answer immediately. He slowly lit a cohiba, the flame from his gold lighter illuminating the deep lines etched around his eyes. He had faced challenges before. Wars with other families, treacherous underbosses, ambitious prosecutors. He had survived them all through a combination of ruthless violence, Machiavellian cunning, and an almost monastic discipline. But this was different. This was a siege. Driscoll was not attacking his soldiers. He was attacking the foundations. He was going after the money. "Leo wants to meet," Sam said, his voice a low rumble. "He is being audited by the IRS. The agent, Driscoll, cornered him in a cafe. He is trying to flip him." Vinny slammed a beefy fist on the table, making the espresso cups rattle. "Then we take care of this Driscoll. A car accident. A mugging gone wrong. We make him disappear." Sam shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No, that is what they want. They are baiting us. They want us to get loud, to do something stupid and violent that they can pin on us. Killing a federal agent? That would bring the entire United States government down on our heads. The days for that are over, Vincenzo. This is a different kind of war. It is not fought in the street with guns. It is fought in courtrooms with paper." He took a long, slow draw from his cigar, letting the smoke curl from his lips. "And Leo is our paper." The unspoken question hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. What do you do with the liability? In their world, the answer was traditionally swift and final. A man who might talk, a man who could connect the boss to the crime, was a dead man. Vinny looked at his older brother, a man he both feared and revered, and saw the cold, pragmatic calculus in his eyes. "Sammy, it is Leo," Vinny said, his voice softer now. "He has been with us since we were kids. He kept your secrets for 40 years. "Loyalty is a two-way street," Sam said, his gaze distant, focused on something beyond the smoky room. He broke the first rule. He called this club. He panicked. And a man who panics is a man who can be broken. He turned his gaze on his brother, and for a moment, Vinny saw the wolf behind the old man's eyes, the predator who had clawed his way to the top of the most dangerous food chain in New York. Everything I built, this family, our name, it all rests on one thing: that I am never in the room, that my voice is never on the tape. Leo is the wall between me and a life sentence in Marion. Now that wall has cracks in it. The feds are chipping away at it. I have to decide whether to reinforce that wall or to tear it down and build a new one.